today we are here to talk about untangling some of the supports that we have for our kiddos and students that have some really complicated needs, right? Are really significantly divergent kiddos and students. And most likely a lot of those students that have communication modes that are not a clear match to what we're used to, which is a verbal output at large quantities, right? And when I think about how we get started, right, every student that we see is just a student, is a human, is a kid. And we show up for them for where and who they are. They're not broken. They are who they are. And so when I think about just the universal level of things, I love the Council for Exceptional Children, the CECs, high leverage practices for special education. And so I always try to think about what is some of the ones we can live in. And what's nice about them is they are like common sense teaching things, but sometimes you have to kind of go back and go, wait a second, do I actually explicitly do some of this stuff? Is this in my practice? Or just I have this idea that is good practice, right? So the three that really jumped out at me from the 23 that are in 22, 23 in the CECs, high leverage practices, is number 11, which is identify and prioritize long and short-term learning goals. When we think about students who have really big barriers or lots of barriers or layered barriers, sometimes progress and progress monitoring is pretty tough to see the growth. And so we've got to really make sure that when we're taking our long-term goals, our high expectations within that child's capacity, right, and doing short-term goals that we can see progression. And when we're looking at what we want to gain, we're always going back, what is my goal, right? Where did I start with? Even if my goal seems like such a really small step. Small steps. We live in the little wins a lot of the times with our more complicated service needs kids. So when we live in the little wins, we got to make sure that we're on a track for goals, whether it's short-term or long-term. The next one that really kind of connected with me is adapting curriculum tasks and materials for specific learning goals. So a lot of times we go to modifying for kids with complicated, complex needs. And modifying is when you're changing it up so much that it's not the same goal anymore. And I really hesitate in thinking and going down that path. We modify way too quickly because we can adapt and access things in lots of different ways. We can look and say, okay, I'm just going to do this core piece out of this big goal instead of changing up the goal altogether. Sometimes we do, and that's okay. We can modify, but we really need to be thinking about what is that access point? How do we make sure that we are sticking within some high expectations, right, within a child's capacity, and thinking about what can I do to adapt versus going and totally modifying and changing it up or being on a totally different path of goals. And the last one is number 15, which is provide scaffolding supports. These students that have complex support needs often get prompted like no other. Scaffolding and prompting is like the thing we do. And I'm going to put out there that oftentimes we over prompt. We are going so extreme that a lot of times we build in learned helplessness. It's one of the fears that we have, right? Or we're going to create this pattern for this kid that they don't have a self-determined path to begin after they leave us. So I challenge us to think about our scaffolds and understanding what prompting does and the levels of prompting, right? How often do we go and hand over hand somebody with a complex learning need? That's really intrusive and sometimes really relationship breaking, the way we are forcing people through things. And we don't really typically get the end result we expect. And then we end up hand over handing forever versus thinking about what is my prompting level? How am I engaging? What is the access barrier here? We go to let's just motor them through it. And if we motor them through it enough, then they'll do it, right? And maybe they will, but does it have any connection to the actual goal you had for them to be able to do it by themselves at some point? Nah, it gets a little tricky, right? So when we think about what we can do when you've got somebody who you haven't had experiences with before. So this is new. I've never met somebody who had this difference, right? We've got to be thinking about where is my experiences, my thought processes, and what biases am I adding to the situation that might make me respond in a way that might not be matching for this person. When we think about how our system shows up for people with really divergent needs, what are their systems put in place so that a child has a communication system anywhere they go in the building, or that the people that will never have her in the room, right? They will never be part, like she's went and didn't have that second grade teacher. She had that second grade teacher. How do we make sure the other second grade teacher knows and can be comfortable responding to Maya or to somebody with a significant difference? And then always looking to see, where's my level to advocate? Because a lot of times people who come to these trainings are the people, I'm a preacher to the choir. Like, we're showing up, we see kids. A lot of our kids with really big differences don't get seen. They only get labeled and identified as whatever their barriers are. And people don't see them as the cool kid that they are. A lot of us that are working directly with students with really different needs and divergent needs, we see the kids. And so we are naturally reacting to them as if they didn't have some of these barriers, where a lot of our colleagues don't have those experiences. And sometimes it is really like they don't see them as human. They see them as their barriers. And that really can be a big mental health issue for the person that they're interacting with, because their interactions are so far off. But it also gives lack of practice. We don't have as many communication partners as options if people aren't paying attention to us or avoiding us because they feel awkward or don't know what to do. So now that we have this way of thinking that we see kids, right? And no matter how they show up, they're not broken. They are who they are. And so we have to adjust and figure out how to meet them where they're at so we can put the next accessible step and support in to help them be the best them they can be. So let's break down this communication thing, because a lot of our students with complex needs, especially in the social emotional range, we can have students who do not have a verbal system that is following the pattern in which we expected, and therefore their communication system doesn't match. Okay. Every student's communication system is valid and is worthwhile. If it doesn't match yours, that doesn't make it bad. Okay. So a lot of times we try to force into our communication style. And unfortunately, when you've got a brain that's set up on a different pathway and a different language acquisition pathway, they don't match, and therefore it becomes very difficult. And even if that child does gain some of the pathways from your communication system, it often turns out to be very awkward, very unnatural, and not sustainable and or quick, because it's not the way their brain processes. And so what we actually are going to get into that a little bit later. But what I want to kind of go through is some of the pieces of communication and how we kind of gain and layer in some of the skills that it takes to be able to have a back and forth and a social relationship with others. It is the development of spontaneous functional communication, emotional expression, and gestures, and trusting relationships between children and adults, right? So when we think about communication, it's got a lot of layers. When we think about joint attention, usually we think about this as the first step. There is no prerequisite to communication, okay? So know that you don't have to have something to be a communicator. You're always communicating, whether or not it matches, whether or not people are recognizing it. There's no prerequisites. But one of the things we often think of as a first step in to try to help get a better match or to get some recognizable pieces is joint attention. So joint attention is that ability of one person to take in information from the other and start to combine it, right? So for use, a lot of times of the strategies we use to teach joint attention are about getting that student into understanding our mode of understanding or what we're paying attention to. And I want to challenge us that it's a two-way street, that when we're looking to purposely work on joint attention, that you also appreciate and enter in to that child's interest, what they are seeking out, right? That it's not all about here, blow these bubbles and pay attention to what I'm doing and getting communication bids through some cause and effect pieces, which is one of the major things we often do with joint attention and practicing joint attention. But going and sitting down next to a student and parallel playing, right? And maybe having a piece of interest item that child is interested in your space. So they have to reach over and then start to involve you, right? But you're not having them enter into your work, not into your interest. You're entering into theirs. Okay. That both are very valid methods to be able to build that idea that we're doing something together, that we can reference something together, and that we have a joint thought about that, which is what joint attention is all about. It's about having that connection and joint knowledge. Okay. What can we learn from them? The pieces that can be really tricky is some of our kids have really, really subtle communication bids or outputs. Okay. So I had a student who did not use verbal output to communicate, but he used his proximity, where his body was in space, to communicate a heck of a lot. And it usually wasn't oriented in the way that we expect. So he would come up to me backwards and stand next to me off to the left, like slightly off to the left, to say hi. Like that's how he greeted me in the room. And he's like, hey, how's it going? Right. And when we take that as a, hey, how is it going? And you say, oh, hey, I'm so glad to see you today. I'm glad you came to school. Like, hey, let's get over to the reading carpet. We're going to go start reading now. Right. When we take those subtle pieces and allow it to be not allow it, but appreciate it for the communication it is. Right. That it's the same thing as saying, hey, Miss Berg, it's nice to see you. Right. Or I'm so excited to be at school today. And what it was him backwards standing right off to the left of me off my shoulder. Right. That those are two equally valid communication modes and should be treated as such. So we have to make sure that we are looking and we're being curious and we're being detectives to see what do we see and what does that indicate to us. The next piece, imitation, it is a myth that students with autism can't imitate. I don't know where that came from. We all have a mirror neuron system that is how we get a lot of information, but a lot of our learning comes from this mirror neuron system and how our body takes in what's happening and other people are doing, either directly copies it, like that would be direct imitation, but also how it kind of layers into experiences. And so it kind of gets to that base thing of yawning, like when you yawn, other people yawn, right? There's a part of the mirror neuron system that happens to that. There is definitely with intonation and with gestures, you will get a lot of the mirror neuron system playing a role in that in your learning and your experience. So know that imitation is a part of how our brain learns and gathers information. We've turned it into in education, this like direct drill and skill piece. Can that be effective? I guess so, but it has a lot of unintended consequences, a lot of rigid motions like do this, right? Is one of the Lavoisian trials within ABA and discrete trial, right? That skill and drill has a purpose, but a lot of times we use it in ways that might break down relationships, might make us miss communication bits that are natural from that student, and also are forcing them onto a system that maybe their brain isn't really naturally going towards to begin with. So we're putting a lot of work into something that won't result in any generalization and or movement forward because it doesn't layer in the brain in the way that they'll be able to access it again. So that's why you see, I did all these skill and drills, but they'll only do it with me, and the generalization is really hard. It's because it's so against how their brain takes in information and takes it back out that it's a lot of work to get that to generalize. Social referencing. So that piece is about how we're the only animal that has social reality. Okay. Lots of animals have social behavior. We're the only one that has a social reality. We put meaning to things, like the idea that murder is bad, right? But even that has a lot of layers. Or that, like in school, one of the social realities is often that you should be quiet while you're listening, which is not true in every culture or across every piece of interaction. But yet that idea that's a thought, that's a group thought that we often impose on people, but that is the social reality thing that no other animal has. So when we think about social referencing, it's a big piece of how we interact. And so having all that social knowledge, Judy Undahl calls it the hidden, actually a lot of people call it the hidden curriculum, that underlying piece of things that your experiences give you this general idea. And typically when you've got a large population of people in one culture base, you've got the same kind of idea, but everybody's going to have divergent ideas within that as well, because your experiences drive your understanding of what's going on in that social world. What's really interesting that I want to mention here is the double empathy problem. So when you think about somebody whose brain is set up in a different way than yours, right? Let's say I am not on the autism spectrum. So somebody who is on the autism spectrum, their brain is coming at experiences in a completely different way than mine is, right? They're both valid, different, but sometimes we'll have the same experience, but totally coding it completely different in our brains. And within school, especially, medical model definitely, but in school especially, we're looking to try to make that person who has that divergent brain mode match ours, right? We'll even say like they need to enter our world. Well, no, the world's the same for everybody. Okay. They're just experiencing their brains coding it in a different way. And it's not bad. It's just different. And so when we stay curious and we think about how they're entering and what their experience might be and appreciate and try to move to match them, we might have a lot more success than trying to always force somebody who's different into our pattern. And we see that across a lot of different things, but we do it a lot with kids with autism. And self-advocates will call it, well, you're trying to normalize me, right? You're trying to make me fit your system. Well, my brain doesn't think like yours. And yes, I want friendships, I want interactions, but that doesn't mean we have to do it your way. Okay. So when we think about social referencing, just like I was talking about with joint attention, the way they show up is just as valid as the way you show up. And so when we look to try to work and have interactions, it's a 50-50 thing, not a they need to come to us. And you're like, well, Katie, the way I think is the way school works. Okay, I can't change that student's brain, nor would I want to, because a lot of really brilliant things come out of people who have really divergent brains. A lot of barriers come with some of the pieces too, but a lot of brilliance comes out of that. And so when you're saying, nope, I only highly value this, I do have a problem with that. Are there things that you want to invite and to teach and to guide and to say, hey, this is the way, like half the second grade is thinking about this, so they have the information? Or is this a mode that we want to try to work on to be able to have it be some opportunity for a student to be able to interact in a more efficient way with those around them? Yeah, that's important. But we can't lose the fact that the way they show up is important too. Okay. Our nonverbal communication is like the majority of what we actually learn from each other. So when we think about what is said in verbal form and what is felt and seen, and I say felt because proximity gives you a feeling as well as the actual seeing of motions. They're all really important things. And when I think about somebody who does not use verbal speech as their mode communication mode, nonverbal communication is where I focus in on. Right? How do I learn their language, their way that their body is communicating to me? How am I using my body to make sure that I'm communicating back to them in a way that is the communication style that they're giving to me, right? And the last one is symbol use. And symbol use basically is language. So for those who aren't speech and language pathologists, know that language isn't talking. Language is like everything. It is all these ideas all put into place. How we communicate. It is so many layers. It is not just spoken speech. Okay. So when we think about symbol use is the representation of an idea. It could be a word. It could be a picture. It could be a concept, right? So symbol use is when we take an idea and put it to something. Okay. So those are kind of a way you can break down what we see as communication. And when you've got a student with really divergent needs in communication, your social is going to be probably divergently different as well. But we have all these kind of pieces to kind of give us an understanding of what this is and where a student might need support and the skill sets we're working on. So this next slide that you see is one about just joint attention. And I love the CERTS model. There are manuals. There's also a lot of virtual training now, although one of the authors comes to our state a lot. But what the CERTS model did was it really took a deep dive into social communication, emotional regulation, and transactional supports in a way that comes from somebody who might be having a different trajectory of language acquisition than maybe we did. And so the three things you see here are shared attention, shared intention, and shared emotion. When we think about communication, it's not all about requesting, and it definitely isn't all about us getting them to do yes, no questions. There's so many layers to communication and how we relate to each other. It's not just the mode. So we want to make sure that when we are looking to move into supporting joint attention, to have more experiences with a person in a joint way, that we're thinking about how are they using their eye gaze or shifting? How are they using their body? How are they using their proximity? Right? It can be in tones of voice, in tones of vocalizations. It could be just the way they orientate their body. And it could be the traditional face-to-face. That communication comes in a lot of different ways. And that when we stay curious and we are looking for it all the time, we can then respond for it and respond to it more often. But when we think about moving forward in joint attention, we want to have both of us be able to follow a distal point, which is taking an object or like your finger and referencing to a thing outside of you into another place, right? We body orient to face things and use our eye gaze a lot, practicing those type of things to be able to gain some of the shared experience, but always remembering that we might do a point where this student might be walking backwards and do a body proximity piece or use a tonation within their a vocalization. Lots of different ways to get to that shared attention, attention, intention, and emotion. Okay, so it's not just about I looked where you told me to look. And that comes to this next slide that's about practice, which is why the word practice is really big. Students who have different communication styles often have a lack of practice, meaning people are not responding to them, and therefore they don't get the chance to have as many interactions or experiences. And what does our brain do? It takes experiences, codes things in, or weeds things out. And so if you don't have that many opportunities to code things in, then your brain isn't going to learn in an efficient way or in a quick way, because you don't have anything to build on. All our learning builds on itself. So if you're not having experiences, if nobody's responding to you because they're not seeing that you're communicating with them, then those are dropped off. And then we often build up a mental health part of nobody wants to listen to me, right? And I'm not getting heard and I'm not being appreciated. And we get these feelings of loneliness and these feelings of anger. We often see students with different communication modes get frustrated really quickly, and often sometimes might have a behavior that harms others or harms self because they're so frustrated, because they're constantly not being responded to when they're clearly communicating. And it's clear to them, but it is tricky for somebody who isn't thinking in that mode or isn't recognizing it to be able to respond. So that's why I really do encourage us to be detectives. Always be looking for it. Always be responding in some way, shape, or form in a positive way to what could be and or your thought of as a communication bid. And appreciate how their brain works. And we can do that through setting up times for parallel play, right? Setting up times to not do ABC 1, 2, 3, but to sit next to the student and copy what they're doing, imitate them, enter into what their play is, what they're flipping in front of their place, or what they're lining up, or whatever the case may be. We can move to purposeful ones like putting things. I like the one where you put things in a clear container that they need, right? And so they have to give you the container to be able to get out, right? So it's something they can't open, but don't do that a ton of times. Don't put the thing back in the container and seal it back up and say, do it again. How frustrating would that be if every time you ask for something, somebody say, great, you asked for it. Do it again. Great, you asked for it. Do it again. Great, and all you wanted to do was play with your car, right? And this person's put the car in that stupid jug 5 times. No, it's got to be natural. It's do the bid, but don't keep forcing it. Don't keep doing, well, I need this many trials, right? That skill and drill part of it. Make it a communication piece. Make it a social piece. We have so many kids when they hit middle school, high school that have so many mental health differences because their brain thinks differently than others. And when you don't fit the social majority or the majority around you, and nobody is taking the time to appreciate where you're at, it just leads to isolation. And we are social beings, right? You don't need 50 million people, but everybody needs some protective factors to be able to cope and build a resilience skill that helps you be the path, the best you for you. When you've got nobody responding to you, it becomes really tough. Repetition of language. can be communicating a lot of stuff. It could be echolalic, and it could be a message that is using intonation to be able to give us something. It could be a cycle that we're stuck in our brain, and it's a regulatory thing. It could be a predictability thing. So when we have situations like that, especially if it's a verbal speech and it's a loop, we've got to stay curious. And a lot of times talking to family can help. Like, oh, like you keep saying, like, put it in the jar, 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 right? And it's like constant. And you say, Mom, what's put in the jar? And they're like, oh my gosh, that's from like Sid the Science Kid. And it was about completing the thing. He needs whatever's done. He needs it to be done. He's saying, I'm done. Can we stop? Can you stop, please? Right. And it's a protest or a verbal kind of thing. So a lot of times it gets really tricky. And so it's hard to follow paths that students are giving us. But that doesn't mean we don't stop trying. So when the act of interaction is actually harmful to others and actually will cause a visceral effect, but the social understanding isn't getting that feedback of like, oh, I don't like to be hit or pinched, right? Isn't getting into being able to have that person go, oh, I didn't mean to hurt you. Like I was just saying hi. Like I had a student who would come and try to bite my arm to say hi, right? That is about creative redirecting to non-harmful things. And that can be pattern-based, but not disappreciate that. You don't want to not appreciate the communication bit. We can be like, oh, like she would come to bite me and I would move my arm so she couldn't bite and go, hey, how are you doing? Right. And I might squeeze hands and I might give some other input that I know that she likes, that would give that interaction piece, but wouldn't have my arm getting physically bit. Right. So when we talk about, like, we think about the redirecting of behavior, I think it more of just shaping the communication bid to be less harmful, but everything's still there. Appreciating the bid, building the relationship, having the practice piece, right? And it's not about the bite, right? I get what that bite's telling me, but I do need to make it safer. So how can I get creative in meeting that child where they're at, giving them that relationship piece, giving them that appreciation for their communication bid, or that like, hey, how you doing? And getting it to be safe for me as well. It is really tough when a person's body adapts to the world in a way that is harmful to the others around them or harmful to self. A lot of times it's about how you place yourself, we look to mitigate it as much as possible, but not to tell them it's wrong, not to, right? We can tell them like, oh, I got hurt, right? But we got to place that in a relationship building piece, not like, no, you can't bite me, right? Which is usually what we do. Like there's no biting, there's no kicking, there's no hitting, which if it's an impulse and it's a body adaptation, they weren't going to be able to interrupt that to begin with. So all of that social shaming and social correction isn't going to divert it somewhere else. So when you've got a body that is really struggling with patterns that maybe even that person doesn't want. We've all got patterns that our body does that we don't want. I overeat, like, like the Lay's, like you can't just eat one. Yeah, that's like the pattern of my life. So like I have that, but I can't interrupt that system a lot of times because there's so many layers to it. With our students with really divergent needs and really significant needs, that's true for them as well. So we have to look at how do we mitigate things, right? This is the reality. How do I make it a little bit less destructive and then a little bit more less harmful and a little bit less? How do I start to shape and move through? And one of the biggest things you can do is relationship build, and go and start trying their stuff out. Stop making all the demands on the way we do things and start doing things the way they do things and being flexible within that. And there's different ranges within that as well. But it's about getting to know student, and looking to see where can I make those little adjustments so we get safer and safer and safer, because I guarantee that kid doesn't want to be hurting people. The one experience I can tell you with a student that I had that did have verbal ability, he did some major harm to me and out of completely a stress response system. And years later, I mentioned it and the mom was like, oh, please never mention that again. He'll be depressed for like a week, because he never meant to hurt me. He didn't want everybody like to be harmed from what's going on, but that's the way his body adapted. So just like I can't stop eating chips, right? My body, and it's not comparable to some of the things that happen with our kids, but I want you to see the brain mode is there, very hard to interrupt. And so to expect that from a kid or to try to punish it out doesn't quite work, or to use really heavy social shaming and social constructs to try to get it gone, is not going to change the way a body adapts. So know that there's a lot of layers to that. But when we get back to that idea of practice, when we look at some other ways we can practice, right? We can enter what they're doing. We can parallel play. We can do, like I said, start putting things into our space that they need, not repetitively, right? That's really disrespectful. Interacting with physical play that you know that they are really into. I used to do arm squiggles, right, with kids, and I would ask permission. You want arm squiggles, right? No, okay, let's go, right? And that was relationship building, and it was physical, so their body would orient to me, and or we could do large body motions. Some kids are super into music, and so we can do the song motions. There's lots of things that we can do to help try to build that back and forth practice. But what we need to do is start purposely putting it into our schedule. That's our lesson, right? And that we have ample time to practice respectfully some of these interactions. So when we think about the different modes and the different things that we use, right now we're looking at a list of things that are nonverbal communication. So we have lots of different things that exude from us as we talk. And we've got facial expressions, dietic gestures, which is using something to reference something outside a body, like pointing. There's body language, how your body, this is used in American Sign Language a lot, how much your body is giving to the message that might be coming through different pieces like your hands or your face. Proxemics, I've already kind of talked about where your body is in the world, how you're reading where your body is in the world, gaze shift, where your eyes point to. I'm going to get in the soapbox for a minute here. Eye contact is not forced, never should be forced, and never should be expected like it's going to give you the end all be all of respect and or knowing that a child is listening. Eye contact in different cultures actually means a lot of different things. Eye contact from a child to an adult in many native cultures is extremely disrespectful. And so if you want to get the idea of respect, eye contact I know it's not the way you go. Eye contact as respectful is an upper European culture piece, right? Which is the majority of Wisconsin when you think about it, but it is not a representative of all the cultures we have here in Wisconsin. Then we go on the piece that some people's brains process eye contact as in giving eye contact is very disturbing. And it's, I met somebody who actually described that looking at somebody's face, there's so many pieces, it is so hard to process. It actually gives them this visceral, it makes them feel sick, visceral effect, trying to process looking directly at somebody. Okay. But eye contact has meaning, right? When we think about a gaze shift, that's different. That's where your eyes are going. And that's telling us something, right? But that's kind of the idea of eye contact. In our minds, there's a very big social piece for eye contact. And so we try to force it. And I'm going to say right now, if that's something you do, let's stop doing that. Let's move on from that. Let's teach what eye gazing means. And that a lot of our teachers, one of the expectations is eye contact to show respect or to show you're listening. So if your goal is to show listening, what can we do? We can look at a shoulder. We can look at the hair, some people can look at a hairline. Okay. So you give the information of what that eye contact piece, that expectation is, but you don't force it. And you don't make it like it's the end all be all. We find different ways, especially for students who really struggle, to notice that they're listening other than eye contact. We really pay attention to eye gazing and body and testing to see what we've got coming in and out of expression from student. Okay. Another nonverbal, we were already kind of talked about some of those behaviors that might be challenging to us, or it might even be harmful to self or others. Okay. All of that can tell us something. So what we really need to do when it isn't the mode that we are most familiar with is to stay curious, stay thinking, what could this be telling me? And it might be telling me that the student's super stressed. It might be telling me, hey, how are you doing? And the thing that I saw was a bite, right? So like that student I had that would come up and bite me. I knew which one was, hey, how you doing? And which one was, help me, I'm really stressed, right? And you're my safe person, so I come to you. A lot of times the people who are the safest people are the ones that are protective factors for kids, are the ones that get harmed a lot, because the communication is help me, help me, help me, and they're punching you or kicking, or like things that are challenging to us or are harmful to us. So know that staying curious is where we start with that, and not looking to get it gone. Not like, let's just behavior punish this out, because most likely it's a pattern of thought that we need to follow to be able to figure out how to move forward. There's lots and lots of different types of assistive technology and different ways that people can access. And I want you to know that we have a lot of resources within the state of Wisconsin. The DPI AT website has a link to like a ton of them. We, like the WADI grant that I know we don't have, it's kind of in a weird place, but they've got that thing on there. We've got resources like the AT Forward grant that we have now that has a community of practice. We have the resource library that is housed in CISA 2's office, but is a statewide thing where you can have different devices shipped out to you to try once you've done an assessment for AT. Because it's impossible to have all the assistive technology full access to you. So when we get to the really highly complicated technology-based ones, we do here in the state of Wisconsin have a resource. And like I said, that link sheet, the DPI website actually is where you want to kind of go to first. But there's a lot of stuff there that you can link into to get what you might need. But knowing that assistive technology, that cognitive prosthetic to help communication come forward can come in a lot of different ways. And it can come in low tech, medium tech, and high tech. And when we start to think about how we approach using maybe a high tech device like a talker, there's a big community of people and self-advocates that are explaining out what it's like to have a talker, but also some of the things we might do that might be counterproductive to using a talker in a productive way. And I'm going to read off what I see on the screen, which is this part where they say, this is what we do to them, right? We don't give them core words that are usable in natural language. We don't give them role models of other people who use devices like them to speak. We don't, there's a DVD out there called Communication Matters. This is pretty powerful. So they're denying, they're saying you're not even looking into why this matters and the belief system behind why the work is important. And then the next one, we will not learn to use your talker, right? So we're not engaging in using the same mode that they are to be able to talk back and forth with them. And we are often denying literacy because we don't work on it, or we stick to labeling ABC for years and years and years. Did you know that knowing the name of A or the letter C or knowing the name of the letter D does not really truly help you in learning to read, right? But how many of our lessons and goals are, we'll know we'll point to the letter B. Okay. There's a piece to that within phonics, right? Being able to match sound to representation, but knowing the name of a letter really doesn't do that much for you. So when you think about what we concentrate on for kids who have significant needs and differences, often there's skill sets that don't even get to what we think they're going to get to, which would be true literacy skills. So we've really got to start questioning yourself. I love this video because not only was it made by self-advocates, and people with lived experiences, it calls us out on the carpet. It says, hey, you're like literally taking my ability to build language and literacy away because you're not paying attention to these pieces. And unfortunately, we're not taught to pay attention to those pieces. There's still a big kind of fight between the SLP world around core words or noun-based, right? And I'll get into that in a little bit. Let's talk just a little bit about echolalia, because I think we've had that mentioned. We've definitely had, echolalia comes up a lot with students with atypical communication systems. And in the 70s, there was a lot of research, and Barry Prezant has done a lot, if you know that name. But this is from an adapted version of something that came out of Amy Weatherby and Barry Prezant's work about kind of two different buckets of language processing. And what's interesting is both of these are the way our human brain works. What happens is in the analytical processing, that's what the majority of people follow, an analytical processing, language process building. Another natural language acquisition process is Gestalt language processors. And what you see sometimes with, usually we'll see it with kids with autism, is they'll get stuck at the echolalic stage, which is taking gestalts, which are chunks of language that are stored in your memory to communicate. And it's very intonation based. Like actually, Gestalt language process is very intonation based. And so when we look at that, this is a very valid language acquisition mode, but we might have students who get stuck at some of those pieces, and therefore they're echolalic, right? They're speaking through a language processing that didn't match most likely the way we did, which gained it, which is the analytic, which is what is seen as the standard. But both are very valid ways to get language acquisition. And you will see people that get to a very useful and generalized, so most of the population has the same kind of communication mode through both of these lenses. Okay. So it's just about where are we getting stuck in. And so when we think about echolale and how we most likely approach it, sometimes we stop it. We stop them repeating things. We go, oh, that's book and movie talk, when no, it's actually really valid communication. And if we dive in and we stay curious, we can figure those things out. So like I had a student who would do these scripts from The Lion King. And I was sitting and we were playing with his sister, and he went in this whole Scar's monologue piece because he was really pissed off at her. Like he was really angry with her. So the intonation fit perfectly, right? His face, his nonverbals all fit, just the words didn't. His body didn't spontaneously come out with, man, I'm really mad at you. It came out with a gestalt, a group of words pulled from memory that had very much the connection to meaning, to what was going on. I'm mad at you, right? And everything gave it to us except the words. But often we get hung up on the words. And when we get hung up on the words, that most literally isn't going to be a literal transition of communication. When we ignore the intonation, when we ignore the nonverbals, when we ignore the context, right? That's where we kind of go wrong. And so with kids who have echolalia, where they're using pattern words in a delayed way, right? Things pulled from memory and chunks, most likely you're having somebody who is on a Gestalt language processor path. And so we got to flip how we kind of approach things, because if we keep going down the analytic, we're trying to force a child's brain into a way it doesn't work. And so we've got to appreciate that. Meaningfulspeech.com has a training that's out there now that is very parent-friendly, educator-friendly, and speech and language interesting. And you can, there's different layers to it. And that's where I got this. And what's really cool is that they also work with people with lived experience, and they're on top of the newest research. But we've had some of this research like in the 70s. And sometimes we look at forcing versus actually appreciating where brain is. And now that we more and more know about brain, and we're starting to be in a place where our culture is okay with adjusting to others, we've got a really cool opportunity to kind of switch the way we approach things around things like echolalia with an atypical communication system. One of the other resources out there that I want to mention is Project Core. These are free modules that go to build some language patterns. I do believe they stick to a analytical brain processing path, but it starts with object-based and then moves you through getting to different representations of language. But also it is based on core words versus nouns, which is what that Language Stealers video was about, not focusing on the I want or requesting piece, and moving on to what is more naturalistic language. Because requesting is not the only way we talk, but there are programs out there like the Picture Exchange Communication System that's like the main mode of it. You don't get to any kind of naturalistic thing till phase 6, and most people don't even get there because they don't follow with fidelity. It is a very known evidence-based practice, and it matches some kids, but it's very cumbersome. It isn't supernatural. It doesn't help in actually gaining language as a naturalistic way of being able to socialize with it. It does patterns really well. It does train you as an educator to do communication modes, communication bids, and put it into practice. but it's a method that's very precise, and most people aren't doing it in the way that it was built to do. So it's when PECS has gone wrong, right? It's not just about pretty pictures, right? PECS is a very has a very stringent methodology that you should be trained in and actually checked in on as you move forward. It's also compliance based. So when we think about natural language, it's not all about compliance, and PECS is very compliance based. So does it match? Does it work? I'm not going to say it doesn't. I'm going to question whether or not we're matching kid well, and whether or not we're doing it with fidelity. And start wondering, like, hey, I've never actually heard of core language. Maybe we could look into that and see what it's going. And I am not saying that picture exchange using visuals, that's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about the methodology and the research practice of picture exchange communication systems. Okay, so don't get those confused because they're not the same thing. Okay, so when we think, and you think you're doing PECS, and you're like, wait a second, am I doing PECS? Most likely you're not, because if you were not trained in it, you do not have the explicit methods that you need to do, you're not doing PECS. Okay, so and know that we have a lot of different other approaches that we can take that might match kid with more layers that might make communication a little bit more functional and a little bit more efficient and a little bit more matching how their brain works. All right, because when we look at how we show up and go forward for a student whose communication mode is divergently different than those around them, and oftentimes are not generally understood, we need to make sure we're working really well with kids, trying to get to know them as best as possible, that relationship building, reaching out to family, and also leveraging all the people in our building. Don't stick to just the special ed teacher trying to figure this out. If the engineer knows this kid and they hang out because the kid really likes sweeping floors, and so he ends up sweeping the floor with the engineer every once in a while, leverage the knowledge the engineer has and what he sees with that child and the interactions they have. So when we think about how we make and having a communication plan for a student who has a mode that's not understood by all, we need to actually make a plan. Right? We make behavior plans all the time. Why not make a communication plan? What are we going to do that we're going to explicitly think about and put into our practice, and making sure we have practice time and making sure we're appreciating bids, and how are we adjusting and making sure we have something we're working on to help that student be able to have their mode understood by more. Okay. There are ways to kind of flip up that I want sequence, thinking about it and making it a little bit more social. This does not totally tie to Gestalt language processors, right? Because they're learning in chunks. But if you have somebody who is gaining language and you're like, I don't want to do the I want noun. I don't want to do the noun one anymore. I want to switch it. This mode is a little bit more socially developed, like socially motivated, or social undertones, right? So you have person, verb, and then the noun, right? So we're adding somebody into the system, whether it's a visual system or it's a talker system, right? But we're talking about having it be an interaction, a natural thing that's happening between people versus just getting things, right? Which is the I want kind of sequence that we typically rely on. When we're looking at trying to gain more information about communication systems, I love the TIE Center. They not only have a ton of stuff that is supporting students with more significant needs, but they have tons of modules. So you have lots of different ways you can access information. So I have the suggestion here up on the screen to go to the website, the tiecenter.org, but then go into the filter in the resource section and put educator family in it, and also put communicative competence. So that search comes out with a whole bunch of really cool stuff that kind of matches what we're talking about today. And it's a highly respected national resource for you to use. Because when we think about communication, oftentimes people want to equate intelligence and awareness and a lot of other things. And we make a lot of assumptions with somebody who doesn't have a communication mode that is understood by all. And I'm here to tell you that that is a really big mistake, right? So a lot of you have heard the least dangerous assumption. So right here, we see the least dangerous assumption on our screen, right? And it's in the absence of conclusive data, educational decisions should be based on assumptions which, if incorrect, will have the least dangerous effect on students. So how does that come out in our thought process? Presuming competence, that just because a student doesn't have a communication mode that is understood by all, does not mean that we can assume that their brain is processing at a different speed, that they are socially, emotionally not gaining the information that's going on, that fifth grader isn't having a fifth grade thought, right? Age level thought, that we don't have students that already know how to read Wretches and Jabberers, which is a movie that often comes up on like Netflix. It comes often on things left and right. And what I have in the PowerPoint is just the trailer for it. It's a bunch of self-advocates that speak through alternative modes, like talkers or computers, or one uses a Ben Franklin speller, to kind of advocate for like, hey, I'm here and I have a voice and I am a person and you can't dismiss me. And it's a really, really powerful way of seeing people with lived experience and self-advocates tell their story. So I highly encourage, if you haven't seen Wretches and Jabberers, to check it out. I was privileged enough to actually see the two main producers in person. And it is amazing, some of the stuff on our perception and their description of what went on when they were in school. One of them, Tracy, described that he learned to read because he taught himself by second grade through Reader's Digest, because nobody was actually doing literacy with him. They were teaching him ABC and labels to ABC. And they did that all the way till he left school. And he was reading in second grade because he taught himself. So we really have to stay curious and think about what is our goal here, and how are we moving forward, and presuming competence that our students, just because they don't have a communication mode that's understood by all, does not mean that they aren't fully aware and possibly at grade level skills. Usually if they're not at grade level skills, it's because they didn't have the practice and or exposure to the grade level information. And so it's not about an intelligence and a processing piece or a retention piece. It's about exposure. And who's the one that gives exposure? Us. So when we think about going into a science class, we might not get the output that we expect. They're not going to take the 7th grade science end of the chapter test. Okay. But does that mean they don't get the information? Does that mean they can't experience watching the same video that all the other kids did, or having either reading and having read the science book to them, or working on the vocab that's involved in that? Because we don't have any clear evidence that they are getting it. Well, we don't have any clear evidence that they're not. And that's what the least dangerous assumption is. It does more damage to assume that they are intellectually delayed when you do not have clear information. And an IQ test for a student who has a communication mode that's not strong enough to be understood by all is not evidence to tell you that they are intellectually delayed. Okay. Sorry. I get really soapboxy on this one because we deny so much because of our assumptions. When we think about the least dangerous assumption, let's say you assume the student is on grade level and you're giving them exposure and experiences and they're totally adapted, right, and accommodated for, but we're still giving them all that exposure, and they are intellectually delayed with retention issues. You're really not going to lose that much to begin with. What you will gain is all the social emotional experiences that kid will have practice with, which is what they will need when they leave us. Okay. Do they need the definition of volcano? Maybe not so much, but do they need the social interaction with their peers? Oh, heck yes, they did. Okay. So we've got to think about that when we think about least dangerous assumption and presumed competence. They come together, right, to create a way to move forward so that we are not limiting children and that we're not the reason they are behind. We're not the reason that Tracy is not engaging in different literacy things because we're teaching him what the letter A is, and he's been reading for years. Okay. It does work the opposite way, that we presume a child has all the pieces and it's the output, the path, that is preventing the knowledge base of that. When we think about exposure, and so now you're somebody who is totally on board with, hey, I'm going to do this presumed, we're just going to go with it and see if we can find different ways for them to communicate their knowledge versus the ways that we typically have it. And they are 12 now and haven't had instruction. Yeah, okay, so that doesn't mean we don't give them instruction. That doesn't mean that we don't move forward in a better way. And yeah, they might be behind, but guess what? There's lots of kids, ones that do not have extremely divergent needs, that are way behind, and we don't stop for them. Okay. So when we think about, and I'll get into some of the academic pieces in just a little bit, when we think about where we're meeting that kid where they're at, we really got to think about what is going to be the path that matches them best. And within an IEP system, guess what? You have all the legal power to make that plan whatever you want it to be for that kid as a team. And so we can follow that path, and we can even change what's going on within graduation or pieces to be able to meet that child where they're at. So if you've got somebody who was separated because of behavior issues or was never actually exposed to academics with fidelity, then we're looking to see how do we close that gap as quickly as we can. How are we going to match that child in the way they learn and the way they show up to be able to get them the things that no one ever gave them. Okay. It's not about going, we don't do that after this age, or they'll never get to it. Now, if you're doing something that you've tried a method and a way of doing it for 12 years and you're not seeing any growth, that's a problem, right? There's a reason why when you have an IEP goal, you have to discuss whether or not you met it or not. And if you didn't meet it, you need to give the reasoning why. The reason why that's in the guidance forms that come from DPI is because we need to be checked the way we're doing things. If it doesn't match kid, and we've got some really significant data to say we're not moving forward, that's not on kid. That is on us. And Andrew F. proved that, and they changed some of the language around it with that big legal thing that went to the Supreme Court about how when you don't change up what you're doing to try to match kid, and it's sometimes we try and we try and we try and we never get there. Okay. Or we don't get where we think we could be. It's the trying piece. We're not magicians. We're not going to magically be able to match every kid. It is a trial and error kind of thing because every kid's so individual. But if we stop trying and we just do one mode and keep doing it, or like when people think that they're doing special education and all they're doing is regular ed repeat, the kid didn't get it in that way to begin with. You got to do something different. Okay. But that doesn't mean changing up the goal. That doesn't mean even changing up what they see in front of them. It's an access thing. It's an engagement thing. Not just a progress thing, not just did they get the skill, did they get the skill, did the skill. Okay. There's lots of layers to that. So we got to think about that moving forward. But there's a lot of reasons our kids are far behind in academics. And a lot of times it has nothing to do with being able to do the academics. So what can we do? What are some things that we can start to move forward with and get kind of going? When we think about some general strategies, consistency at the base. Sometimes we can have the mode in which we present a lesson the same all the time, and it changes and becomes novel in the things that we talk about. When I'm talking about explicit instruction here, I am talking about purposely putting it into your practice. And explicit instruction is modeling, practicing, and setting up for independence. That's what explicit instruction is, okay? So when I mention it here in these general strategies, it's because I want you to put into your practice modeling, practice, and a plan for independence, right? Bringing off that prompting piece, which if you are even thinking about prompting, try the evidence-based practice module on the firm website. Remember, it's in that link sheet on prompting, and it'll blow your mind because we go to hand over hand like no other. And man, there's so many other layers we could be doing and meeting kids where they're at. So when I say it's not skill and drill, that's not what I mean by explicit instruction. I mean modeling, practice, and plans for independence, okay? And modeling, remember we talked about that communication, using their communication mode, whatever one is the one that it flows out with them the most natural. Routines, right? Routines can help anybody who is feeling stress goes to rigidity as part of how to bring their stress system back down because their brain wants predictability. So routines can be great things to leverage to be able to help a student who has really layered needs because their brain won't have to process and could be a regulatory practice to have things be in an expected pattern, okay? Practice creates language muscle memory. So not only does physical practice matter, language practice and communication and social practice matters. Aided language modeling, which is a little bit more technical, which your SLPs, I'm hoping you're like, oh, I know what that is, or now I'm going to look into what that is, right? Looking at how we are approaching our communication systems and not sticking to the expectation of show up like me, Okay. I've already mentioned core vocab, and I am not saying that all other ways to approach are bad. I'm saying match kid. Core language gives us a really naturalistic way of communicating. And so if it matches kid, we've got a better process to be able to move forward, to have their brain be able to latch on to what we're learning, right? And then there's errors learning and prompting. There is a time to not let a kid fail, to just practice through a model and go with it. We test. It's like we're testing our kids with special education needs all the time. They have to try to do it independently, constantly. That's part of it. But remember, I said explicit instructions, modeling, practicing, then plans for independence. We don't need to, we set the pattern, here we go. Now you have to try it and try it and try it and try it, right? That skill and drill, we get stuck in a lot. Sometimes we just need to engage. Sometimes we just need to access it socially. Lots of other goals we can have, other than, did they give me the right vocab word for this social studies lesson? Or did they blah, 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 blah within this academics? Okay. And we can use errorless learning and things like that to help us have experiences, to help us practice, so that we don't get stuck in learning the same thing over and over again. And when we think about where kids physically are within their learning, there is a continuum of services. And I am not here to tell you that a child who is self-contained should not be self-contained. Okay. I'm telling you that we make these decisions based on our needs most of the time, not kid needs. Have I met students that I would not put into a group of 30 kids at a regular second grade? Hell yeah, I have. Like, that would be so disruptive to the way their body works, and they'd be adapting in ways that would be harmful to them, harmful to the others. Like, it would be a disaster. But it's not based on my need, because they have so many needs, they need to be in a separate setting. It's based on that child's needs. Okay. And we very, I don't want to, there's not enough examples of true inclusive practices and inclusion within our state, because our logistics are set to take them down. We have this pie in the sky idea, and we put it into our missions and visions that every student should, this is an inclusive environment, whatever inclusivity layer of marginalized people you might be thinking about being more inclusive to, right? The thought that every kid is kid and that we adjust to that kid, that's inclusion. What that looks like, sounds like, gonna be different for every kid, especially your more significant students, gonna be very particular to that kid. And so when we look at, does that mean they need to sit inside regular ed all day? I don't know. I don't know your kid. Does it mean they can't sit inside regular ed all day? Absolutely not. You don't know until you know that kid, and we need to figure it out. Okay. But it shouldn't be based on our logistics. And you're like, Katie, that's a pie in the sky kind of thing. And like, I realize that our school systems are not set up to follow the missions and visions they have and the whole inclusivity piece, nor are we even set up to follow the law with the least restrictive environment piece. But it's always, what's my next step? Where can I go next to get to that best practice piece, get to what the law was meant to do, and to get to true inclusivity, that people are people, and I show up for you because, you know what, you're human just like me, and I appreciate that. And that we don't follow medical models of you're broken, I fix you. We follow the model of I'm here to help you be the best you can be. Okay. Whatever that next step is in your practice, go for it. Right. Don't let logistics take over. I understand that is a battle. And sometimes it's a battle we just cannot fight every time, but always have it. Where's my next step? Because access is not reinventing the wheel, right? It's just giving people the things in different ways, right? That's what special education is all about. It's doing something special, but that doesn't mean the end goal has to be different, right? We need opportunities to engage. We need opportunities to interact with each other, opportunities to explore. Those are the things that get taken out when we start calling it special education, when we say it's specially designed instruction. We lose all these social emotional components to learning and how our brain works. And when you start going, no, I'm going to fight against that, I'm going to come back into what is everybody else doing? What's the natural environment? What's happening here? And I'm going to say, how can I access this in a different way? How can I set up my environment to just produce an engagement piece that would match that kid? Then I'm going to look at what's my progress? Where are we moving through the skill sets and the goals that we have? But a lot of times our kids with more different needs, less engagement, less interaction with people, usually of their age, and they don't get to explore. It's always this test. Do this, skill and drill, which is not exploration. Learning happens in mistakes, but we don't let our kids oftentimes make safe mistakes and explore it because we're like, well, look at the pattern. That'll be wrong. That'll be the wrong pattern. And we get so wrapped up on it took so long to get a pattern that we get the wrong one, which is a discussion for some kids, but we overgeneralize that to so many children. So let's talk about some academics. Let's talk about math. And there's some really cool resources out there for kids on the spectrum and kids with more intellectual disabilities. And so these are some of my favorites. They come out of some pretty brilliant people that are really tied to the most up-to-date research. The first one is a math resource, and it will be on the link sheet that came out of the CEC, which is what I mentioned at the beginning, right? They're a big national, very trusted research-based organization. And when we're thinking about problem solving, which when we think about problem solving, often we think within math, and that's the lens that's on your screen right now. You see a couple columns. We see explicit instruction. Remember, model, practice, independence, right? So actually using explicit instruction for math and problem solving, especially, is a mode we should start thinking about. Then we've got things like supportive things like graphic organizers, like number lines and diagrams and picture prompted tables. How often do we picture prompt the language inside our math? Not often. We sometimes get really good with literacy, but not so much inside math. Then we've got the next column, systematic instruction, right? Thinking about task analysis, breaking down what it actually takes to get something done. And it can be down to the nth degree. I love resources that do like math trajectories that actually get to cardinality, like understanding that a number represents amount, right? So the number 1, if you see that written out, represents a group of one object, right, on a table that pairs. Just like the letter or the phenome, which I realize I do that really badly, but could be replaced by B in written word. Okay, we've got that within math too, but we often don't go that far down in understanding the steps of learning math to know those pieces and task analyzing what it actually takes to get that math done or that problem done. And then always thinking about your least intrusive prompt. Always thinking about how do I have the most independence I can. Using things like manipulatives, that's our next column, right? The more concrete I can make it, the more experiences I've had. Because when you have an object, right, you have more experiences versus just the idea of pen. So you saw me pick up a pen. I can actually feel the pen. I can see the pen. That has so many more experiences than my brain has to code. Right? If this was a manipulative in math, like I probably should have like a math block or something that show you, right? Versus me just saying pen or 1. Okay. And then tech aided instruction, right? Things like calculators, anchor videos, things that you can watch before you go and you do the process, text to speech. Okay. So when we think about accessing more divergent skills, we can kind of think about some of these things and give us a path of how to show up for student versus just repeating the same thing over and over and over again and just trying it over and over and over again and expecting a different result. Okay. We've got options. We've got ways we can move forward. Some of the barriers that can cause some access issues within problem solving, right? Your reading level, right? So we can definitely work through reading level adjustments to be able to access the structure and the task analysis piece being too cumbersome, needing to be broken up in little bits, right? Quantities and content, right? Some of these are things that we need to talk about when we've got somebody who's got a lot of different barrier needs when we're working on problem solving. And then vocabulary, making sure that our symbols and our use are matching what kid understands as what that piece is within the math that we're working in. So like I said, the resource that this all comes from is in that link sheet that is at the end of this PowerPoint and is also on the website for this training. So lots of different ways you can access that. Let's get to literacy. Literacy isn't any different. Neither is math, right? They're not different. But yet our kids with significant differences, 90% of ACC users, people who use devices, do not gain literacy skills. And do you think it's because they use a device? No. It's because we don't expose them to it. We do, this is a letter A, for years and years and years. And they don't get the practice. They don't get the modeling. Half of them aren't even in, not even half. I have no idea how many of our kids aren't even in literacy rich environments. What builds literacy? The base of it, a literacy rich environment, right? And we deny them these things. We get stuck on teaching things that probably don't even build in literacy. And that sometimes is back to the fact that sometimes we have students with really divergent needs and barriers in rooms all by themselves, or with just a special ed teacher, not just, but with a special ed teacher, that you weren't groomed to teach literacy unless you went and explored that for on your own, because you're there for access, engagement, and progress. But now you're in charge of knowing that content. Well, FYI, there is a population of general ed teachers that don't even have enough knowledge within literacy to teach it well, right? It really gets to me when I can go and ask a group of elementary school teachers, what are the big 5 things in reading? And they have no idea. And that's the core pieces of literacy, right? Writing, phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, and comprehension. That's what literacy is. It's all those things. It's not just phonics, but we get layered in phonics. Like it's like this thing that's the only thing that's happening. We skill and drill. We take literacy and all the things that we're doing within literacy totally out of context. And so again, we're drilling and skilling these phonics or phonemic awareness and not giving the whole range of what actually literacy encompasses. We don't do creative writing with kids with more significant needs often, right? Where you just give them a writing utensil and just say, hey, tell me a story. And they make marks on a paper and they're like, wow, you know what? That kind of looks like a dog. Were you writing a story about a dog or was it something else, right? And letting them explore in that creative writing piece, or using the talker to be able to put words and just coming, oh, like, wow, you pressed diarrhea 3 times. Are you telling me a joke about diarrhea? Because it is not time to talk about diarrhea, right? Like, I guess we could. Would you like to build a story about diarrhea? And then they indicated yes. All right. We're writing a story about diarrhea. You cannot fault me if I gag, right? And having that experience, our kids don't get those experiences because their communication style doesn't come out as understandable to others a lot of the times. And therefore you're missing it all and then not getting the practice. Yes, a lot of times we have to fill in gaps and they might be wrong. And it might actually end up being disrespectful to the person. That's why I always love, did I get it wrong? Right? When I have to guess or fill in and make an assumption, I always want an option of like, ooh, did I get it wrong? Okay. We need to make sure we're putting in experiences, make sure we're practicing, make sure we appreciate what they're giving us, whether it's a communication mode that is just different than mine or appreciation of whatever output they give. The fact they gave us an output. Thank you. I'm so glad. I'm so sorry that I'm not quite sure where you're going with that, but thank you so much for telling me because I'd really like to hear your voice. Right. And that we are not denying them literacy by not having literacy-rich environments, by not doing shared reading pieces, by not doing all the other pieces, all the other kids are automatically given in their environment. Okay. And that's why one of the reasons you're legally required to have a natural environment teacher or a regular ed teacher, a content teacher on your IEP teams. And sometimes we like cheat and don't have them. No, they're supposed to be giving us, if we've got a child who isn't in their room, the information we need so they can have that exposure. Okay. That's why they're there, to help you stay on top of it and to make sure we show up for kid. And they're helping us make decisions on what should be presented in front of student. Okay. Again, logistics cause us a problem and our schools are not set up that way. We are set to silo and say, this is yours and this is mine versus going, hey, we all have expertise. How do we all get this going to show up for kid? Which is the breadth and understanding and the theory behind IDEA and the reason why we have IEPs. Another soapbox real quick here. The look of material matters. Make it socially appropriate. I am not telling you that a child's interest should be ignored. So if you've got a 19-year-old that super loves Teletubbies, we appreciate that. And we figure out ways to navigate that. But I'm not watching Teletubbies inside my high school class because my kid likes Teletubbies, right? We've got a social dynamic piece that we are creating there that we don't want to. He can totally love Teletubbies. I am okay with that. But how we navigate that world, very, very important. How inside the school setting, in home, totally different, right? I mean, I love Minions and I'm an adult. Like it's not, Minions weren't meant for me, but my ringtone, if you call me, is the Minions, right? So we all do it in different ways, but yet we need to not disappreciate the interest. But I choose to socially adjust with it. We have to give that to that child that option as well, so that we're not putting their interest in front of everybody if it's not something they would choose to share with everybody. But often what we do with students with more complicated needs is we use whatever skill level we're working on. We use that when it was given in the natural or the universal progression of things, that material. So I'm using a second grade or a kindergarten book with a high schooler. We got to stop doing that. We have so much out there that is adapted to do the same thing, but with age appropriate things that we can approach and give, versus working with a thing full of bunnies and you've got a 15-year-old that if we had anime characters would totally be into it, right? So lots of free stuff, lots of things out there to be able to do that. But we got to stop just using what we got and making sure we're using age appropriate materials. Because our goal is to help our kids be the best them they can be and not need us, whatever level of not needing us that means. For some of our students, they're always going to need support in some way, shape, or form when they leave us at 18 to 21. But that doesn't mean we're not always thinking about what's the next step of not needing us, okay? And some of the ways we can approach taking that path, teaching them about how their brain and their body works so that they can become self-advocates about what they need and know what they need and seek it out, helping them learn how to make a goal and to follow steps to get to that goal, that it's not all our goals that are important, that you can make a self-driven goal and there's steps to that. And then having them be a part of their IEP, whatever that looks like. Just having a student pick interests to share or even go through and use a button to go through a PowerPoint of all the things they like before a meeting starts helps that team be more individualized with the kid. Or they start helping write some of their goals. And we ask them the question, does this work for you? When we do this, does it work? Do you like it? Right? And appreciating when they're like, no, I really don't like the number line. Cool, let's figure out a different way. When you become more self-determined, we can start asking ourselves these pieces, right? So would you become more independent or more dependent in following this piece of what our support, right? Are we noticing any loss of freedom or privacy? Privacy is a huge one that we step over a ton. Is it going to block the ability for that person to make relationship with their peers? Okay. A one-on-one adult, hands down, blocks the ability for kids to make relationship with peers. Not that I'm saying it's not needed, but that is an unintended consequence that we need to be thinking about and thinking about where that adult is within their life at all times. Are we squashing creativity? Are we looking at having the mental health pieces? Are they self-conscious? Are they lonely? Did you ask them to move away? And did you actually follow the request, even though it doesn't match what you need right now? If they tell you I need to stop and they're advocating for stopping, we need to follow that. Because if another kid yelled at us, stop, I need to stop, and it wasn't something that happened a lot for them, we would stop for them. But because it happens a lot for our kids and it stops the progression of our learning path, we don't. And we try to barrel through. And we touch and manipulate and move our kids with more significant needs way more than we need to, and a lot of times without permission. And we got to start thinking about that. Okay. Getting back to that hand-over-hand piece I was talking about. There is a really cool video made by the People for Developmental Disabilities, so made by self-advocates. And it's a really nice one to help build that belief system of where are we going? Don't limit me. I have a path and it's my path. So if you want to be on this path with me, help me be on my path with me, right? Don't tell me my path. Don't give me my path. Help me be the best me I can be. What I want you guys to do right now is to think of one thing you're awesome at. Okay. Think something you're awesome. So I said something today and you're like, dude, I totally already do that. Right. And I want you to put that in your head. Now, after you put what you're good at in your head, I want you to take a second and I want you to think of one thing that you heard today that can change your practice. So you either enhance something you already do, take out a practice you don't want to do anymore, or put in a new practice as a result of what you learned or heard today. Okay, so come from that idea that you do awesome things, because we do. We do awesome things and we don't appreciate it enough. But if you leave here after spending an hour or so listening and don't have an action item to move forward, That's where we miss the mark. We don't reflect enough and move forward. So I want you to commit to taking an action from something you heard today, whether it is enhancing something you already do, making it better, taking it a step further, putting it towards best practice, further to best practice, taking something out of your practice that you're like, oh, you know what? That doesn't match anymore, right? It was something I was taught to do. It was something that we've done for years, but you know what? It sounds like probably not a practice I want to continue doing. Okay, take it out, just pivot. Or you're like, oh my gosh, I didn't break math down that way, or I didn't I'm going to try this. Put something new into your practice. All right. Thank you so much for spending the time with us. I hope to see you again.